A cowboy rides through the Arizona desert with a half-empty flask and a death wish. 13 years ago, he killed a boy his own age in the Civil War. And every night since, that boy's face waits for him in the dark. He doesn't care if he lives or dies anymore. Then a gunshot cracks from the bluff above the road, and a stagecoach with a woman inside goes flying toward a cliff with a 200-foot drop. He chases it down, breaks his ribs, stops it with his bare hands, and pulls out a woman whose eyes hold no fear, only calm. She's a mail-order bride running from a man who tried to sell her, heading straight into the arms of another man who's even more dangerous. The town's most powerful merchant chose her on purpose, because she has no family, no one to ask questions if she disappears. Now a broken cowboy, a half-Apache blacksmith, and a woman with a stolen scalpel and stolen money are the only ones standing between a corrupt empire and the truth it will kill to protect. Welcome to Wild West Stories channel, where dusty trails lead to untamed hearts. Stories of cowboys, courage, and love forged in the fire of the American frontier. This story will teach you that the people worth loving are the ones brave enough to show you their scars, and that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to finally save yourself. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, pass it along to a friend, and subscribe so you never miss another Wild West tale.
The gunshot cracked from the bluff above the road at the exact moment Jackson Miller was thinking that maybe today was the last day he wanted to be alive. He had been riding south toward Vulture City on a morning so hot the air itself seemed to tremble. The flask on his saddle was half empty already, and it was barely past sunrise. Not enough whiskey to make him drunk. Just enough to blur the edges of the dream that had ripped him out of sleep at 3 in the morning, same as it always did. The Union boy's face. The way the kid's hand had reached out before he fell. 15 years old, same as Jackson had been, and Jackson had watched the light leave his eyes like water draining from a basin. 13 years since Chickamauga, and that face had not aged a single day. His horse Ranger moved beneath him with the patient, rolling stride of a well-trained animal. Jackson had raised him from a colt, and Ranger knew his moods better than any person alive. The stallion's ears were forward, relaxed, trusting that whatever direction Jackson pointed him was worth going. Jackson wished he shared that certainty. He was 28 years old, and he had built himself a ranch north of Vulture City with his own 2 hands. He trained wild horses for sale, not broke them. Trained them. The distinction mattered to him even if nobody else cared about the difference. He was good with animals because animals did not ask questions he could not answer. The gunshot changed everything. It came from the bluff to the east, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls and rolled across the flat desert floor like thunder. Not aimed at him, aimed at the stagecoach approaching from the opposite direction on the Phoenix to Vulture City road. The team of 4 horses bolted the instant the sound hit them. Jackson saw the whole thing unfold in the space of 3 heartbeats. The coach lurched sideways so violently that the driver pitched off the box and hit the ground rolling. The man tumbled through the dust like a rag doll and lay still against a boulder. The stagecoach was a runaway now. 4 panicked horses pulling 1,200 pounds each, running blind, dragging a wooden coach behind them at a speed that turned the wheels into a blur. And they were heading straight for the canyon curve. Jackson knew that stretch of road like he knew the scars on his own hands. A sharp bend where the trail hugged a cliff face, then fell away into nothing. 200 feet straight down to the canyon floor. If that coach hit the curve at this speed, it was going over, and whoever was inside was going to die. He did not think about what he was doing. That was the truth of it, and it mattered. He did not make a brave decision. He simply reacted. And the deeper truth, the one he would not examine until much later, was this. He acted not because he was courageous, but because he did not particularly fear dying. That was a different thing entirely. And the difference would come to matter in ways he could not yet imagine. He kicked Ranger into a dead gallop. The pursuit was ugly from the start. Ranger was fast, faster than most horses in the territory, but the stagecoach team had panic in their blood and a quarter-mile head start. Jackson pushed his stallion hard, leaning low over the animal's neck, the hot wind tearing at his shirt, dust and grit stinging his eyes. He pulled alongside the rear of the coach first, close enough to see the wood splintering where it bounced over rocks, close enough to hear a woman screaming inside. Not a scream of panic exactly. Something sharper than that, something that sounded almost angry. Jackson pushed Ranger forward along the side of the coach. The wheels threw gravel at them like buckshot, cutting his cheek, and he tasted blood mixed with road dust, grit between his teeth. He got level with the team and made his first attempt. He stood in the stirrups and launched himself at the harness rigging. He missed. His hands caught air and his body slammed against the side of the lead horse. He bounced off and nearly went under the wheels. The rear axle clipped his boot, spinning him sideways, and only Ranger's instinct to stay close kept Jackson from falling beneath the coach and being crushed. He hauled himself back into the saddle. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. Second attempt. He drove Ranger tight against the team, so close their bodies touched, and he leaped again. This time his hands caught the harness leather, fingers closing around the traces like a drowning man grabbing rope. He held on with everything he had. The led horse kicked backward. The hoof connected with his ribs on the left side, and he heard the crack before he felt it. At least one rib, maybe two. The pain was like a hot iron shoved through his side, and for a moment his vision went white and his grip nearly failed. But he held on. He dragged himself forward along the harness, hand over hand, every movement sending fire through his chest. He got his fingers around the reins that were flying loose and pulled. The horses fought him. 1,200 pounds of terrified animal against 170 pounds of stubborn cowboy with broken ribs. The leather reins cut through his palms like dull knives, and blood made them slippery. He wrapped them around his forearms, took the cutting deep into his skin, and hauled back with everything he had. The horses began to slow, not fast enough. The canyon curve was right there. Jackson could see where the road bent sharply and the ground just fell away into blue sky and empty air. He pulled harder, shouting at the horses, his voice steady despite the pain because steady was all he had. The coach stopped. The rear wheels were hanging over the edge of the canyon. The wood groaned like a living thing, creaking and popping, and the whole coach teetered on its balance point like a scale waiting for a feather to tip it one direction or the other. One wrong movement, and it would go over. Jackson secured the reins to the harness with hands that were torn and bleeding. He slid down from the lead horse on shaking legs and moved to the coach door. Every breath felt like someone was stabbing him with a hot knife, and he was pretty sure one of those broken ribs was pressing against something it should not be pressing against. He wrenched the door open. The woman inside was not cowering in the corner the way he expected. She was halfway out the door. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her right palm was split open and bleeding from what looked like she had grabbed a door hinge with her bare hand. Her auburn hair had come completely loose from its pins and hung around her face in wild tangles. But her eyes were what stopped him. Green. A deep, clear green with flecks of gold that caught the morning light like sparks. And those eyes were not filled with tears or terror. They were calculating. He could see it in the way they flicked from his outstretched hand to the angle of the coach to the drop behind her. She was doing math. She was figuring out whether the shift in weight from climbing out would send the coach over the edge. She was the calmest person in this entire disaster, and that included him. Their first words to each other were stripped to function. "Give me your hand," Jackson said. "Slow. The coach can go." "I know," she said. He pulled her out. The moment her weight left the coach, the whole thing groaned and shifted. They ran. 5 steps, 10, 15. And behind them, the stagecoach tipped backward with an awful slowness and fell. The sound was enormous. Wood splintering, iron shrieking, the horrible crash of the whole thing hitting the canyon floor 200 feet below. And then silence. A silence so deep it felt like the desert was holding its breath. Rebecca turned and looked at the empty space where the coach had been. She looked down at herself, at her torn dress, her bleeding hand, her dusty shoes. Every possession she owned had been in that coach. Clothing, keepsakes, her father's medical journal, all of it gone. She said in a voice so flat and calm it was almost frightening. "Well, that is that then." And then she fainted, not from weakness. Jackson understood that even as he caught her, and the movement sent a bolt of white-hot agony through his broken ribs that nearly dropped him to his knees. She had been holding herself together on pure will, and the will had simply run out. He lowered her to the ground as gently as he could, breathing in shallow gasps because deep breaths were no longer available to him. He looked up at the bluff where the gunshot had come from. Sunlight glinted off something on the ridge. Glass. The unmistakable flash of a spyglass lens catching the sun. Someone was watching them. That gunshot had not been random. This had not been an accident. Jackson looked down at the woman unconscious in his arms, her auburn hair spread across the red Arizona dust, and he felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with broken bones. He did not know her name yet. He did not know why she was here or where she had come from or what she was running from. But he knew, with a certainty that scared him worse than the canyon edge, that his life had just changed, and Jackson Miller was not a man who handled change well. Rebecca woke on a strange bed in a room that smelled of carbolic acid and bourbon, to find a man she had never met stitching her hands shut without having asked permission. Her first instinct was to pull away. She yanked her hand back and pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, eyes sweeping the room for exits. Old habits from her Uncle Aldrich's house. "Never let someone touch you before you have assessed the situation." "Easy now," the man said. He was in his late 60s with tired eyes behind wire spectacles and hands that were steady as a surgeon's despite the whiskey she could smell on his breath. "I am Doc Henderson. You are in my clinic in Vulture City. That hand needed closing up, and I did not think you would want to wake up still bleeding." Rebecca forced her breathing to slow. She looked around. Small room, single window letting in harsh white light. A glass cabinet of medical supplies. The smell of alcohol, both the medicinal and the drinking kind. In a chair in the corner sat the man who had pulled her from the stagecoach. His chest was wrapped in bandages visible through his open shirt, and his face tightened with pain every time he breathed. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, and she could see the raw, torn skin where the rains had cut through. He was watching her with gray eyes that looked a decade older than the rest of him. "How are the ribs?" she asked him. And both men in the room stared at her. She looked at the bandaging around his torso. By the way he was breathing, she could tell. Shallow, careful, favoring the left side. "2 broken," she said. "Maybe 3. Lower left." Doc Henderson's eyebrows went up. Jackson just looked at her like she had started speaking a language he did not know he understood. "My father was a surgeon," Rebecca said. "Union Army. He taught me." The doctor nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his expression. "Well then, what can you tell me about your own injuries, miss?" Rebecca looked at her hand. Laceration across the palmar surface, approximately 3 inches. Clean edges, but deep enough to require sutures, which you have already placed. She flexed her fingers experimentally. 7 stitches, I would guess. Adequate closure. The bruising on my left arm is from the coach door, no fracture. Soft tissue damage only. Doc Henderson almost smiled. "Your father taught you well." Rebecca looked past the doctor and through the window at Vulture City. It was not what the agency brochure had described. The town was raw and mean. One main street of warped wooden buildings baking under a sun that seemed to have a personal grudge against everything below it. The heat shimmered off the hard, packed ground like water that wasn't there, playing tricks on the eye. 2 saloons with bat-wing doors that swung lazily in a wind that brought no relief. A small church with a crooked steeple that leaned slightly east as if the building itself was trying to leave town. 3 establishments at the far end of the street that were not trying very hard to pretend they were anything other than brothels. And in the center of it all, the largest building on the street, freshly painted white in a way that looked almost obscene next to the weathered gray of everything around it. A sign across the front read, "Preston Mercantile." Miners moved through the streets, mostly Mexican, some Chinese, a handful of white men. The non-white miners kept to the south end of town, a separation that nobody had written into law, but everybody seemed to understand. As Rebecca watched, a native woman carrying a bundle approached the door of Preston Mercantile and was turned away by someone inside. The woman stood for a moment, then walked away without protest as though she had expected exactly that. Rebecca filed the observation away. She was good at filing things away. The door to the clinic opened and a man walked in who changed the temperature of the room by his presence alone. He was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it had never met the Arizona sun despite living under it. Dark hair slicked back with too much oil. He wore a suit in weather that called for shirt sleeves, and his eyes moved over everything they touched with the efficiency of a man taking inventory. "I was told the Phoenix stage had trouble," the man said to Doc Henderson first, not to Rebecca, not to Jackson, to the doctor, who was the only person in the room he apparently considered worth addressing. Was there a passenger? A woman? Rebecca's skin prickled. Something about his voice. Not the words themselves, but the sound underneath them. A clipped, commanding cadence that stirred something in her memory. She had heard that voice before, or something very like it. On the bluff, before the gunshot. She had heard someone shout from above the road. She had thought it was the driver, but the driver had been behind her. The shout had come from ahead and above. One or two words distorted by wind and distance, impossible to make out clearly. She had filed it away during the chaos without really processing it. Now, hearing this man speak, the filing cabinet in her mind rattled. She could not be certain. She might never be certain. But the wrongness sat in her gut like a stone. The man turned to her. His eyes performed their inventory. They moved from her face to her hands to her torn dress to her figure, with the specific detachment of a man assessing merchandise rather than meeting a person. He did not ask if she was all right. "Where is your luggage?" he asked. "Gone," Rebecca said. "The coach went over the cliff. Everything I had was inside it." Something crossed his face. Not concern. Displeasure. A flicker so brief most people would have missed it. Rebecca did not miss it. "I am Robert Preston," the man said, "your intended. I had expected you this morning, but obviously under better circumstances. I have arranged a room for you at the boarding house. Mrs. Harmon runs a respectable establishment. I will call on you tomorrow and we can discuss our arrangements." He did not shake her hand, did not touch her elbow, did not offer any physical gesture of comfort or welcome. He simply delivered the information and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Miss Norton, you should rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." Then he was gone. In the corner chair, Jackson Miller sat very still. He had been watching Preston with the quiet intensity of a man who reads animals for a living. Body language, eye movement, the things that show on a face when words are trying to hide them. Something was nagging at him, and he could not quite put a name to it. The gunshot on the bluff, the runaway coach, Preston's reaction when he walked in. The man had been concerned about the luggage and the schedule. He had not been surprised that the stage had trouble. It was a subtle thing, but Jackson's survival had depended on reading subtle things for most of his life. Preston had expected disruption. Maybe not this much disruption, but some. Jackson waited until Rebecca and Doc Henderson were occupied with wound care. Then he stood carefully, holding his bandaged ribs, and stepped outside. Eli was waiting. Elijah Crow leaned against the hitching post across the street, arms crossed, watching the door of Preston Mercantile with dark eyes that missed nothing. He was 32 years old, half Apache on his mother's side, half white on a father's side he did not acknowledge. He worked as the town blacksmith, and he was the best tracker in the territory, though he would never scout for the army on principle. He was also the only person Jackson trusted with anything close to the truth. "Went up to the bluff," Eli said without preamble or greeting. "Found brass, 4440 Winchester. Boot prints with hobnails. Same tread Drake wears. Jackson processed this. Silas Drake. Preston's sometime employee, rumored enforcer, never proven dirty in a way anyone could take to the law. A tall, scarred man who spoke little and did what Preston paid him to do without asking questions or showing remorse. Eli continued. That is the fourth incident on the stage road in 2 months. Same stretch of road every time, always when the cargo is worth taking. Jackson looked at Preston's store. The lamp burned inside despite the late hour. Through the window, he could see the thin silhouette of the man moving behind the counter. Someone is using that road like their own personal bank, Jackson said quietly. Eli nodded. And someone in that store knows when the vault is full. They stood in silence for a moment. 2 men who had learned that silence was more honest than most things people said out loud. Jackson rode home to his ranch that night with his ribs screaming and his mind churning. He lay down on his narrow bed in his small house that he had built with his own hands and waited for the nightmare. The Union boy, the forest in Georgia, the crack of the rifle and the look on the kid's face. But the nightmare did not come. Instead, he saw green eyes looking at him with absolute calm in the middle of chaos. A flat, steady voice saying 2 words that should not have been remarkable, but somehow were. I know. He woke in the dark feeling something worse than the usual dread. He felt afraid. Not of danger or death or any of the things that had long since stopped scaring him. He was afraid because he wanted to see her again. And wanting things was how you set yourself up to lose them. And Jackson Miller had lost enough for 1 lifetime. Rebecca knew she should feel grateful. Instead, standing in her future husband's store on her 3rd day in Vulture City, she felt like she had crawled out of one cage and into another. This one just had better inventory. Preston Mercantile was the only general store in town, and it showed. The shelves were full, but the prices were predatory. Rebecca had been keeping books since she was 14, taught by a father who believed that a woman who could read a balance sheet was a woman no man could cheat. And she recognized the arithmetic of exploitation within her first hour behind the counter. Preston had her organizing stock, maintaining ledgers, greeting customers. He framed it as preparation for her wifely duties. Rebecca recognized it as an audition. She passed easily. Her penmanship was clean, her arithmetic fast, her manner with the townspeople polished enough to reflect well on Preston without outshining him. She had spent years in her Uncle Aldrich's house learning how to be useful without being threatening. The skill transferred. But she was watching. She was always watching. The ledger discrepancies were the first things she noticed. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet, consistent pattern. The interest rates Preston charged on credit, and half the town bought on credit because there was no other option, were higher in the actual books than what he quoted customers verbally. 3% became 5% on the page. 5 became 8. Small enough that most people would never notice. Large enough over time to bleed a town dry. She noticed how he treated his 2 Mexican employees. Curtly, dismissively, never by name. You and boy, regardless of the fact that one of them was a man 10 years older than Preston with grandchildren. She noticed Silas Drake. The hired gun came into the store after closing one evening while Rebecca was sweeping the front floor. Preston closed the back room door. She heard nothing specific through the wood, only the quality of their voices. Preston's was the clipped authority she had felt she recognized since the first day. Drake's was deference. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. Drake left through the back without acknowledging her existence. Rebecca swept the floor and catalogued everything. He is like Uncle Aldrich, she thought. Same species. Controls everything through money and fear. Different costume, same animal underneath. She kept her face blank. She had been keeping her face blank for years. On her 4th day in Vulture City, Jackson Miller came to town. He was there on business. A horse he had finished training, a steady bay gelding, sold to a mining foreman for a fair price. His route to the livery took him past the mercantile, and that was where he found Rebecca trying to wrestle a 60-pound crate of canned goods through the front door. Preston had told her to bring it in. He had 2 employees who could have done it in half the time. He did not ask them. Rebecca did not know if this was a test of her willingness or simply evidence that he did not care about her comfort. Both options concerned her. Jackson stopped his horse, dismounted, walked over and picked up the other end of the crate without asking permission, the way you would for anyone struggling with a heavy load. They carried it inside together and set it down by the dry goods shelf. Their exchange was brief and awkward, in the way conversations are between 2 people who have shared something enormous and have no framework for what comes after. "How is the hand?" Jackson asked, nodding at the stitches still visible on her palm. "Healing," Rebecca said. "I took the sutures out myself this morning." He frowned. "You should have let Doc Henderson do that." "I have been stitching and unstitching my own wounds since I was 14, Mr. Miller. I'm quite capable." Silence. Jackson looked at her with an expression she could not read. Respect, maybe, or surprise, or something that hurt, some recognition of a reality he wished were different. "You should not have had to learn that," he said. Nobody had ever said that to Rebecca before. People had praised her self-sufficiency, admired her competence, relied on her capability. Nobody had ever suggested that these qualities might be symptoms of a problem rather than virtues. Nobody had ever looked at her skill at taking care of herself and seen, underneath it, the years of having no one else to do it. She did not know how to respond. So she said, "Thank you for the help with the crate, Mr. Miller," and went back inside before her face could betray her. That afternoon, Rebecca walked to the post office. She had no one to write to. She had no family, no friends, no connections anywhere in the world who would care whether she lived or died. But she needed a reason to leave the store for 30 minutes, and pretending to mail a letter was the best excuse available. The post office was a small room at the back of the express company office. Wanted posters covered the bulletin board by the door. Horse thieves, mostly. A notice about a lost mule. A territorial tax announcement that nobody would read. And then she saw it. The notice was pinned between a wanted poster for cattle rustling and an advertisement for patent medicine. Simple text, professionally printed, the kind of thing that got mailed in batches to post offices across the Western Territories. Missing person. Rebecca Norton, age 24. Auburn hair, green eyes, sought by family in Richmond, Virginia. $50 reward for information regarding her whereabouts. $50. That was nearly 3 weeks' wages for a minor. It was enough to tempt anyone in this town, and the phrasing was calculated with a precision Rebecca recognized because she had grown up watching Aldrich calculate. He had not called her a thief. He had called her missing. He was playing the concerned uncle, the worried family member. If someone responded to this notice, Aldrich would come to Arizona not as a man reclaiming stolen money, but as a loving relative searching for a lost girl. The law would be on his side. The sympathy would be on his side. Rebecca would be the ungrateful niece who had run away from the family that took her in. The $200 she had taken would become his trump card. Money that had been part of her father's estate. Money Aldrich had claimed as compensation for housing her. Money that by rights should have been hers. But rights and law were not the same thing, and Rebecca knew which one mattered in a courtroom. She tore the notice down, folded it into her coat pocket. Her hands were shaking. She noted the symptoms clinically, the way her father had taught her. Elevated heart rate, tremor in the extremities, perspiration onset, diagnosis, fear. She turned to leave and walked directly into Jackson Miller, who was stepping through the post office doorway. Their eyes met. He saw the fear on her face, saw her hand pushing something into her pocket. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "I am fine." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jackson recognized the specific quality of that lie, because he had lived inside one just like it for 13 years. The brittle, too quick reassurance of someone who is being hunted. He knew the taste of those words, because he spoke them himself every time someone asked if he was doing okay. But he did not press, because he had things he did not want anyone asking about either. They stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, two people carrying secrets. And then Rebecca excused herself and walked back toward the mercantile with her heart pounding so hard she was sure the whole town could hear it. That evening, Jackson sat in Eli's blacksmith shop on the edge of town, drinking coffee. Eli did not keep whiskey. He had watched too many men on the reservation drink themselves into the ground, and he would not contribute to the tradition, not even for a friend. The forge was banked low, just enough heat to keep the coals alive. The shop straddled the invisible line between the white section of Vulture City and the Mexican mining settlement to the south, which was fitting because Eli himself straddled a similar line, half Apache, half white, belonging fully to neither world. He had made peace with it, or said he had, which was not quite the same thing. Jackson mentioned Rebecca, tried to keep his tone neutral and conversational, failed completely. Eli, who was straightening horseshoe nails with a small hammer, did not look up. "You are falling for Preston's mail-order bride," he said. "I am not. You have brought her up 4 times in 10 minutes. I counted." Jackson opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Eli waited with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that silence won more arguments than words. "She is in trouble," Jackson said finally. "I do not know what kind yet, but she's running from something." "Everybody in this town is running from something," Eli said. "That does not make her special. That makes her one of us." He set down his hammer. "What makes her special is that you noticed. You do not notice people, Jackson. You notice horses." Jackson said nothing to that because it was true, and there was nothing useful to say about it. Eli told him about Garza, a Mexican merchant who had tried to open a competing general store in Vulture City the previous year. The store had been a modest operation, just basic supplies at fair prices, but it threatened Preston's monopoly. 3 weeks after opening day, the building burned in the night. Nobody proved anything. Nobody tried very hard to prove anything. Garza left town the next morning with his wife and 2 children and did not look back. Eli added regarding Drake. "He disappeared 2 days before the stagecoach got hit. Now he is back. You can draw your own lines between those dots." Jackson looked at the ceiling of the forge, where the heat from the coals made shadows dance on the timber. Those dots drew a picture he did not like. That night at the boarding house, Rebecca burned the missing person notice in the stove. She sat at the kitchen table and watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. And she thought about the distance between Richmond, Virginia, and Vulture City, Arizona territory, and whether it was far enough. She was beginning to suspect it was not. Hattie Harmon sat across from her, silent, watching with the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had spent decades reading the people who passed through her house. Hattie was 58 years old, stout and strong and kind in a way that was more practical than sentimental. She knew everyone's business in Vulture City because everyone ate dinner in her dining room at one time or another. After the notice had finished burning and there was nothing left but gray ash, Hattie spoke. "I burned something once too," she said, "so nobody would find me." Rebecca looked at her. Hattie looked back. There was something in the older woman's eyes that Rebecca recognized, a kinship that did not need to be explained. "Someone is looking for you," Hattie said. It was not a question. Rebecca did not answer. She did not need to. Hattie nodded. "You do not have to say it. But remember something, child. Secrets in a small town are like rattlesnakes under a porch. They do not stay hidden forever. And when they come out, somebody gets bit." Rebecca stared at the ashes in the stove and thought about rattlesnakes and porches and the $200 she had taken from Aldrich's desk and the distance she had put between herself and everything she had ever known. She wondered if it would be enough. In her heart, she already knew the answer. The horse bit Rebecca on the same afternoon. She decided she would never allow herself to fall in love with Jackson Miller. It was 2 weeks after the stagecoach, and she had walked 2 miles from town to his ranch in Arizona heat that could kill a man who was not paying attention. Her excuse was a tin of antiseptic salve from Doc Henderson, who had insisted Jackson's ribs needed tending and that Rebecca should deliver it since she was, quote, The only person in this town with medical sense and the good sense to use it. Rebecca suspected Doc Henderson of matchmaking, but she took the salve anyway because the truth was that she wanted to see Jackson's ranch. She wanted to see where he lived, how he lived, what kind of space a man like him built for himself when he was not being watched. The ranch was small. A house and a barn and some corrals set against the base of a red rock ridge that provided shade in the afternoon. Everything was hand-built, rough but solid, the kind of construction that prioritized function over beauty but achieved a kind of beauty anyway through its honest simplicity. No paint, no decoration, just good timber and tight joints and the evidence of a man who knew how to work with his hands. Jackson was in the corral with a horse, not Ranger. This was a different animal entirely, a wild mare, coal-black, with scars on her flanks and white showing in her eyes. She moved around the corral with the nervous, aggressive energy of a creature that had been given every reason to distrust the world and had taken the lesson to heart. Rebecca stood at the fence and watched. Jackson talked to the horse. Low, steady. The same words repeated over and over in a voice so gentle it barely carried to where Rebecca stood. Easy, girl. Easy now. I am not going to hurt you. Nobody is going to hurt you. The mare trembled. She rolled her eyes and flattened her ears and stamped her feet, but she did not charge. And gradually, so slowly that Rebecca could barely track the progress, the horse allowed Jackson to place his hand on her neck. Just his hand, nothing more. A touch that said, I am here, and I am not a threat, and I will wait as long as you need me to. Rebecca watched and realized she was seeing Jackson without his armor for the first time. Around people, he was stiff, terse, hard to reach, like a man standing behind glass. But with this damaged, frightened, dangerous animal, he became someone entirely different. Patient, attuned, gentle in a way that made her chest ache because it showed her what he was capable of when he was not afraid. She climbed the fence. She should not have. She knew even as she was doing it that it was foolish. But the pull of watching him with that horse was stronger than her good sense, and Rebecca had never been a woman who let good sense win when curiosity was on the other side of the scale. The mare saw movement, panicked, wheeled, and before Jackson could react, the horse lunged and bit Rebecca's forearm hard enough to make her cry out. Jackson was between them in an instant, pulling Rebecca back through the fence rails, his face a mask of fury and fear. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted. It was the first time she had heard him lose his composure, and the sound of it was startling. Raw and loud and genuinely afraid. "I told you she was dangerous." Rebecca looked down at the bite mark on her arm. Examined it with the detached clinical interest her father had drilled into her. The skin was broken in 2 places, but the wounds were shallow. More compression damage than tearing. It would bruise badly, but it was not serious. "She did not break through," Rebecca said calmly. "It is a defensive reflex." She looked up at him. He was breathing hard, his hand still gripping her shoulder where he had pulled her away from the horse. His gray eyes were wild with anger that was really fear wearing a mask. "Like you," she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rebecca had ever heard. Jackson wanted to be angry. She could see him reaching for anger because anger was familiar and safe and he knew what to do with it. But he could not get there because she was right, and they both knew it. He brought her into the house to clean the bite. First time Rebecca had been inside. She looked around while he filled a basin with water. The house was like the man. Clean, bare, functional, unlived in. No curtains, no ornament, no evidence that anyone took pleasure in being here. Just a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a shelf of supplies that would have looked appropriate in a military barracks. Except for one thing. On the mantel above the cold fireplace in a small wooden frame was a photograph. A group of young soldiers in Confederate gray. Boys, really. Some of them were smiling. Some of them were trying to look older than they were, the way boys do when they want to be taken seriously by a world that has no intention of being gentle with them. Rebecca looked at the photograph but did not ask about it. She knew how to read boundaries, and the tension that came off Jackson when he noticed her looking was a boundary as clear as a barbed wire fence. He sat her down at the table and cleaned the bite wound with care that seemed at odds with the size of his hands. His fingers were rough, calloused, twice the width of hers, but they moved over her skin with a precision and gentleness that reminded her of watching her father work. Careful, deliberate, aware that the body he was touching belonged to someone who could feel pain. "You have careful hands," she said quietly. Jackson released her arm like it had burned him. Stepped back. The wall went up again, brick by invisible brick, and the man who had been gentle with the horse and gentle with her wound was gone, replaced by the one who stood behind glass and spoke in short sentences, and never let anyone stay close long enough to see what was underneath. Rebecca did not push. She understood walls. She had plenty of her own. She was about to thank him and leave when hoofbeats pounded into the yard, and a rider came around the corner of the barn at a gallop. A young Mexican man, dust-covered and panicked. "Mr. Miller," the man gasped as he pulled his horse to a ragged halt. "My brother, in the mine." Timber fell on him, his leg. "There is so much blood and the doctor has gone to Prescott. Please, there is nobody else." Jackson was already reaching for his hat. Rebecca was already reaching for the salve tin, which contained basic medical supplies alongside the antiseptic. "Take me there," Rebecca said. Jackson turned to her. "You are not a doctor." "I have set 17 fractures, Mr. Miller. How many have you set?" He stared at her for 2 heartbeats. Then he put her on Ranger and they rode. The mine was a 30-minute ride south. The injured man, Diego, was in a shaft that smelled like copper and dust and fear. A collapsed support timber had pinned his right leg. The bone was exposed below the knee, a compound fracture of the tibia, white bone pushing through torn skin. Blood everywhere. The femoral artery was intact, or he would have been dead already, but the surrounding tissue was badly damaged, and the bleeding was serious. Rebecca dropped to her knees beside the man, and became someone Jackson had never seen before. She was calm, not the false calm of someone suppressing panic, but the genuine, focused calm of a person who has been trained for exactly this kind of moment. Her father had been a battlefield surgeon, and he had taught her on the bodies that came back from the front lines missing pieces. She had seen worse than this. She had fixed worse than this. She talked Jackson through what she needed from him. "Hold the leg here. Apply pressure there. Give me that splint." "No, the other one. Tighter. Hold it steady. Do not let go no matter what he does." They worked together without speaking beyond necessity. Jackson followed her hands. He literally watched them and mirrored their movements, his strength channeled through her direction. His hands held what hers could not. His weight stabilized what hers could not reach. They moved together like 2 halves of the same instrument, and it was the most intimate thing either of them had experienced in years, and it had nothing to do with romance. It was trust enacted through the body. It was the discovery that they fit together in a way that made both of them better at the work. Diego survived. Rebecca set the bone, controlled the bleeding, fashioned a proper splint from mined timber, and instructed Tomas on wound care and the signs of infection that would require immediate attention. Her Spanish was limited, but medicine has its own language, and she spoke it fluently. They carried Diego out of the mine and onto a makeshift stretcher. By the time they had him loaded on a wagon headed for town, the sun was going down, and the desert was turning from white to gold. Rebecca leaned against the rock wall outside the mine entrance, and her hands started shaking. Not during the procedure. During the procedure, she had been rock-steady, sure as sunrise, her father's daughter in every way that mattered. But now, with the crisis past and the adrenaline draining out of her like water from a cracked cup, her hands shook so violently she could not have threaded a needle to save her life. Jackson stood next to her. He did not speak. After a minute, without asking permission, he took her trembling hands in his and held them still. His rough, torn, oversized hands wrapped around her small, precise ones, and he held them. And he did not say a word. He just stood there in the failing light and held on until the shaking stopped. When it was over, and her hands were still again, he let go. They looked at each other in the dusk. "Thank you," Rebecca said, "for today, for helping." "You did the work," Jackson said. "I just held things." "Sometimes that is the hardest part," she said, knowing when to hold on. She walked back to town alone because she needed the time and the distance to think. The desert cooled quickly once the sun went down and the stars came out in numbers that still shocked her. A Virginia girl used to tree-lined horizons. She walked and she argued with herself. Do not love him. You have no right to love anyone until you stop running from what you have done. You cannot drag someone else into the wreckage of your life. But her hands were still warm where he had held them, and the warmth would not go away no matter how hard she tried to reason it out of existence. That night, Jackson went into the barn to check on the wild mare. Hellfire, he had been calling her because the name fit. The horse that bit everyone, that kicked and fought, and would not let a living soul get close. She did not back away when he entered her stall. For the first time since he had brought her to the ranch, Hellfire stood still. She watched him with dark eyes and let him approach. Let him place his hand on her forehead. Let him press his own forehead against hers until they stood together in the dark barn, breathing together, man and horse, two damaged things beginning to learn that patience might be worth more than fear. She was right, Jackson said to the horse. You and I are the same. Bite first, ask later. But if someone is patient enough. He did not finish the thought. He was not ready. The third robbery happened on a Friday. Rebecca knew it would, because she had heard Preston say the word Friday through a closed door. And she had not told anyone because she had not been certain enough, and because certainty was a luxury she could not afford to be wrong about. It had been 3 weeks since the stagecoach rescue. 3 weeks during which Rebecca had been working in Preston's store, keeping his books, organizing his stock, and quietly assembling a picture that grew darker with every detail she added. The latest robbery hit a stage from Prescott carrying mining equipment and payroll. 2 passengers robbed at gunpoint. The express guard shot in the shoulder. He would live, but barely. The whole town was buzzing with anger and fear, and Rebecca sat in her room at Hattie's boarding house that evening and laid out everything she knew, like a doctor laying out instruments before surgery, the ledger discrepancies. Preston recorded income from what he called private sales on dates that matched exactly with stagecoach robberies. The amounts were too regular, too consistent to be coincidence. Drake's pattern. The hired gun disappeared from town 2 or 3 days before each incident, then reappeared afterward. Always the same timing, always the same quiet return. The after-hours meetings. Preston and Drake behind a closed door, always in the days before a robbery. Rebecca could not hear the words, but she did not need to. The pattern was the evidence, the overheard phrase. Friday shipment. Spoken by Preston to Drake through the backroom door. 2 days before the Prescott stage was hit. On a Friday. And underneath all of it, the thing she had not allowed herself to fully examine. The voice on the bluff the day her stagecoach was attacked. Preston's voice. She could not prove it. She would never be able to prove it. But the possibility lived in her chest like a piece of shrapnel too deep to remove. She added one more item to her accounting. The letter Preston had sent to the marriage agency, which she still had. He had requested a wife who was, in his words, educated, presentable, and without family connections that might prove inconvenient. He had chosen her because she was alone, because there was nobody to ask questions if she disappeared, because she was, in the mathematics of his planning, disposable. Rebecca picked up a pen and began to write. She documented everything in the precise clinical language her father had used for medical charts. Dates, amounts, observations, correlations. She separated confirmed facts from reasonable suspicions. She noted the gaps in her evidence and the conclusions that those gaps could not quite support. It was thorough, methodical, and devastating. When she was finished, she hid the document inside the lining of her coat. The coat was the one possession from Virginia that Preston had never touched. It was old and unfashionable and beneath his notice, which made it the safest place she owned. That same night, Jackson and Eli were riding west. Drake was in the saloon, which gave them a window. Eli had been tracking the hired gun's movements for weeks with the quiet patience of a man who had learned tracking from an Apache mother and brought to it a white man's stubbornness. He knew where Drake went when he left town. An old mining camp in the hills west of Vulture City, abandoned when the vein played out, far enough from the road to be invisible, but close enough to reach the stage route in under an hour. They dismounted and approached on foot. The camp was just a sagging cabin and a collapsed ore shed. But somebody had been using it. Fresh horse droppings, boot prints in the dust, a fire ring with warm coals. Inside the cabin they found what they had expected, and worse. Crates of stolen goods from at least 2 robberies, weapons, clothing, mining equipment still bearing the shipping labels of the companies that had purchased it. And in a tin box under a loose floorboard, an envelope bearing the stamped letterhead of Preston Mercantile. Inside the envelope were $50 in cash and a list of scheduled stagecoach routes for the coming month. The list was written in a hand that was precise and careful and matched the handwriting in the store ledgers that half the town had seen. Preston's handwriting. "That is enough," Eli said. "Take it to Baker." "Baker owes Preston money," Jackson said. "He will not move." Then the U.S. Marshal in Prescott. Jackson knew Eli was right. That was the correct course of action, the lawful thing, the responsible thing. But he also knew that if Preston was arrested, the investigation would consume everything in its path, and Rebecca was standing in the middle of that path. She was Preston's fiancée. She lived in his sphere. Lived. In a town this small, the association alone could destroy her reputation, and reputation was all a woman had in the territories. He was caught between doing the right thing and protecting the person he cared about, and those two things did not overlap as neatly as he wished they would. Eli read the hesitation on his face the way Jackson read hesitation in a horse, clearly and without misinterpretation. "You are not thinking about justice right now," Eli said. "You are thinking about her." Jackson did not deny it. There was no point lying to Eli. "Get your head straight, Jackson. This is bigger than your feelings for Preston's woman. The word Preston's landed like a slap. It was meant to. They took what they could carry as evidence." Eli wrapped the envelope and the route list in oilcloth while Jackson memorized the layout of the cabin and its contents. Then they rode back toward town with the desert cold on their faces and the stars burning overhead like a million distant fires. Jackson passed the boarding house on his way to the ranch. A lamp burned in Rebecca's window. She was awake. He stopped Ranger, looked up. After a moment, Rebecca appeared at the window. She was looking down at the street, her face lit by the lamp behind her. She saw him on his horse below, and they looked at each other across the distance. 2 people holding heavy things, both afraid, both wanting to set them down, and not knowing if it was safe. Neither spoke. There was too much to say and no way to say it from the street to a second-floor window in the middle of the night. After a long moment, Rebecca raised her hand. Not a wave, just her palm pressed flat against the window glass. A gesture that meant nothing specific and everything important. "I am here. I see you." Jackson looked at that hand for 3 heartbeats. Then he turned Ranger toward home and rode into the darkness. The next morning, a boy from the boarding house delivered a folded note to Jackson's ranch. Rebecca's handwriting was economical and precise, like everything else about her. "I need to speak with you. It is important. Not about us. About Preston." Jackson read the note. He burned it in his stove and watched the paper curl to ash, and his hands were shaking. Not from whiskey, though there was a bottle within arm's reach and he could have used it. From something he had not felt in so long he barely recognized it. Hope. And hope, he knew from bitter experience, was the most dangerous thing a man could carry. Jackson Miller had kept his secret for 13 years. It took a woman who could look him straight in the eye without blinking to make him decide to let it go. Rebecca arrived at the ranch on a borrowed horse from Hattie's stable. She dismounted with the ease of someone who had ridden before, though Jackson could tell from the way she moved that she was more accustomed to Eastern saddles than Western ones. She tied the horse to the post and walked to the porch where Jackson was waiting with coffee already poured. They sat apart. Not close like lovers, not far like strangers. Somewhere in between, in the territory that did not have a name. Between them sat a tin coffee pot and 2 chipped cups, and more unspoken truth than the morning air could hold. Rebecca spoke first. She was, Jackson was learning, the kind of person who moved toward difficulty rather than away from it, and she did it with a directness that was almost unsettling. She laid out her evidence, the ledger discrepancies with specific dates and amounts. Drake's pattern of absences and returns correlated with robbery dates, the overheard phrase, Friday shipment, the after-hours meetings between Preston and Drake, the timeline that connected all of it into a picture that was damning even with its gaps. She presented it the way her father had presented diagnoses, calm, sequential, supported by evidence, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed. She did not exaggerate or speculate beyond what the facts could support. She was honest about what she knew and what she merely suspected. When she finished, Jackson was silent for a long time. Then he told her what he and Eli had found, the stolen goods in the abandoned mine camp, the Preston mercantile envelope with the route list, the handwriting that matched the store ledgers. They looked at each other and the recognition was immediate. 2 halves of the same puzzle assembled from different angles, clicking together with the sick certainty of a diagnosis confirmed. Preston is the architect, Rebecca said. Drake is the instrument. Jackson nodded. The question is, what we do about it? A pause. Then Jackson asked the thing that had been pressing against the inside of his skull since he received her note. Why are you telling me? Why not Sheriff Baker? Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Jackson could hear the wind moving through the scrub brush and a hawk calling somewhere in the distance. Because I am running too, she said finally. Not from the law. From family. If I get tangled up in a criminal case against Preston, my name goes into records, maybe newspapers, and the man who is looking for me will know exactly where I am. She did not elaborate. She gave him the shape of the secret without the details, and Jackson accepted it because he understood. He was running too. Different direction, different reasons, same desperation underneath. They discussed strategy, the evidence needed to reach the U.S. Marshal's office in Prescott. Neither of them could carry it. Jackson leaving town would arouse suspicion, and Rebecca absolutely could not go. Eli would carry it. He knew the road, he was fast, and he was not connected to either Rebecca or the investigation in any way that Preston could anticipate. While they waited for the marshal, Rebecca would continue playing the obedient fiancée. Keep working in the store. Keep her head down. Give Preston no reason to suspect that his careful empire was being documented from the inside. Jackson hated every word of this plan. You will be living under the same roof as a man who may have ordered the attack on your stagecoach, he said. His voice was level, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed what the words did not. He did not order me killed, Rebecca said. He ordered the cargo stolen. I was collateral damage he was willing to accept. That does not make me feel better. It is not supposed to make you feel better. It is supposed to keep me alive long enough for the marshal to arrive. Silence settled between them like dust after a windstorm. Then Jackson, looking at the desert rather than at her because he could not have said this to her face, began to speak. I was 15, he said. I lied about my age to join up. Everybody was enlisting, and I did not want to be the boy who stayed behind. So I told the recruiting sergeant I was 18, and he did not look too close because they needed bodies. He paused, took a breath that hurt in ways that had nothing to do with his ribs. Chickamauga. September of '63, middle of the fighting, I came around a tree, and there was a boy in blue maybe 10 feet away, same age as me. Could not have been more than 15 himself. He was raising his rifle, and I was raising mine, and I was faster. Another pause. Longer. I saw his face before I pulled the trigger, and I saw it after. Sometimes I still see it. Every night for 13 years, that boy has been waiting for me when I close my eyes. Rebecca did not say she was sorry. She knew, with the instinct of someone who had spent her life reading pain, that sorry was not what he needed. Instead, she said something that cut through 13 years of self-punishment with the clean precision of a scalpel. You are still here. That means you chose to keep living, even when you did not always want to. Jackson looked at her. It was the first time anyone had spoken that truth about him without judgment or pity, or the useless reassurance that time heals everything. She had simply named the thing that was true and let it stand. They sat in the silence that followed, and the silence was not empty. It was the sound of two people who had each been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just set it down, if only for a moment. Rebecca stood to leave. Jackson stood with her. They faced each other in the slanting afternoon light that turned the desert gold and painted long shadows across the porch. "I am going to break the engagement," Rebecca said, "not because of you. Do not think that. Because of me. Because I will not sell myself to a man who lists me as a line item in his accounting." Jackson said, "I was not thinking that." "What were you thinking?" A long pause, difficult. The words came out rough, like he was pulling them through a fence. "I was thinking that if you break the engagement, then I will not have to stand in that church next week and pretend I do not care." It was not a declaration of love. It was not poetry or romance or any of the things Rebecca had read about in novels during the lonely years in Aldrich's house. It was just honesty, rough and clumsy and unvarnished and real. For Rebecca, who had lived among lies her entire adult life, it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever offered her. She did not kiss him. She stepped forward and placed her hand flat against his chest, over the place where the broken ribs were healing. The hand motif turned on its axis. "Healed yet?" she asked. "Getting there? Good." She rode away. Jackson watched until she was over the ridge. At dusk, Eli left for Prescott. He carried the evidence in his saddlebag, his rifle across his knees, and the grim expression of a man who was doing a dangerous favor for a friend, and was not entirely sure it was warranted. That night, Jackson stood on his porch in the darkness and watched the sky. Hellfire was restless in the corral, pacing and stamping, her ears flat against her head. The mare kicked the fence posts hard enough to rattle the rails and rolled her eyes at shadows that were not there. Jackson stepped off the porch and looked toward the road. 3 points of light were moving along the trail in the distance. Torches, carried by riders on horseback, moving in the same direction Eli had gone. Eli's horse came back to Vulture City without a rider at 9 in the morning. By noon, Jackson Miller had found his only friend beaten half to death on the Prescott Road. By sundown, he had lost the woman he had not yet admitted he loved. The boy who brought the news ran to Jackson's ranch at a dead sprint, his face shining with sweat and fear. The riderless horse had walked into town trailing its reins, and everyone who knew Eli's bay mare knew that horse would not come home without a rider unless something had gone very wrong. Jackson saddled Ranger in under a minute and rode north at a pace that was hard on the horse and harder on his healing ribs. He found Eli 4 miles up the Prescott Road, propped against a boulder in the thin shade of a mesquite tree. He looked bad. His nose was broken, pushed sideways across his face. 3 ribs cracked by the careful way he breathed. 1 eye swollen shut, purple and black and seeping. Blood dried in his dark hair from a scalp wound that had bled freely before clotting. His lip was split in 2 places and his knuckles were raw, which told Jackson that Eli had fought back hard before the numbers overwhelmed him. 3 of them, Eli said through damaged lips. Drake and 2 others. They took the saddlebag. Jackson felt his stomach drop. The evidence. But then Eli, who was not and had never been a fool, added something that brought the ground back under Jackson's feet. "I mailed a copy of everything to the marshal's office from the way station before they caught up. I was not going to carry the only copy like some kind of idiot." Relief flooded Jackson, tempered immediately by the reality of what Eli had endured. The mailed copies would reach Prescott. The evidence was still in play. But the original documents were gone, which meant Preston now knew that someone was building a case against him. Jackson got Eli onto Ranger. The ride back to town was slow, each step of the horse drawing a grunt of pain from Eli that the man tried to suppress and could not. Along the way, Eli said the thing that Jackson did not want to hear. They knew which road I was taking. Either they followed me or someone talked. And then, looking at Jackson with his one functioning eye, Eli said with the quiet, corrosive bitterness of a man who had nearly died for someone else's cause, "I got beat half to death carrying evidence about your girl's fiancé. You want to tell me again this is not about her?" Jackson had no answer for that, because Eli was partly right, and the partial truth was worse than a clean lie would have been. He had asked his only friend to risk his life, and the reason was not entirely justice. Part of it was Rebecca, and that part had nearly gotten Eli killed. He delivered Eli to Doc Henderson's clinic and made sure the doctor would keep him overnight. Then he started looking for Rebecca. He did not find her at the boarding house or at the Mercantile. He found her behind the church, sitting on the back steps in the shade, her face the color of old paper. She had been waiting for him. She had heard about Eli's horse coming back riderless, and she had known what it meant. "Is he alive?" she asked before Jackson could speak. "Alive, beaten badly. 3 ribs, broken nose. He will be laid up for weeks." But he got the copies mailed before they caught him. Rebecca closed her eyes. The relief on her face was real, but it was woven through with guilt so thick Jackson could see it weighing on her like a physical load. Jackson told her the rest: the ambush, the missing saddlebag, the implication that Preston now knew someone was investigating him. Rebecca listened. Then she told Jackson what had happened on her end. Preston had called her into the back room of the store that morning, closed the door, spoken to her in a voice so calm it raised the hair on the back of her neck. "I know you have been asking questions about my business, Rebecca. I know you have been talking to Miller. What I am deciding right now is how I want to handle it." He knew, not because Rebecca had made a mistake, but because Preston had built his empire on information and control. One of the Mexican employees had noticed Rebecca studying the ledger after hours, lingering on pages that had no relevance to her assigned duties. The man reported it to Preston because Preston paid him an extra $1 a week to watch and report. Preston had informants. That was how he operated. That was how he kept everyone in Vulture City exactly where he wanted them. Preston had not shouted or threatened. He had negotiated the way he negotiated everything, as though Rebecca's future were a business transaction with terms to be discussed. "You have 2 options," he had said. "1, you stop asking questions. You marry me on schedule, and nobody gets hurt. 2, you continue on this path, and I send a wire to Richmond, Virginia, informing your Uncle Aldrich Norton that his missing niece, the one who stole $200 from his household, is currently residing in Vulture City, Arizona territory." Rebecca's voice was steady as she recounted this, but her hands were gripped together in her lap so tightly that the knuckles were white. Jackson felt the world shift under his feet. "He knows about your uncle," he said. "He investigated my background before he agreed to the agency match. He chose me because I had leverage points. A woman with secrets is a woman who can be controlled." Rebecca looked at him, and he could see the fear in her eyes, but also something harder underneath it. Resolve, maybe. Or just the exhaustion of a person who has been carrying lies for so long that the weight of them has become unbearable. "He knows about my past, Jackson. He knows why I came west." The air between them went very still. "Why?" Jackson asked. Rebecca told him. She told him about Aldrich, the uncle who had taken her in after her parents died and treated her as a burden to be managed rather than a niece to be loved. About Cornelius Marsh, the 55-year-old widower Aldrich had arranged for her to marry. About refusing and being locked in her room for 3 days. About the $200 she had taken from Aldrich's desk. Money that had been part of her father's estate, but which Aldrich had claimed as reimbursement for housing her. She told him she was, in the eyes of Virginia law, a thief, even though the money was rightfully hers, even though Aldrich had stolen it first. The law did not care about moral arithmetic. The law cared about whose name was on the account ledger. She told him she had been lying about who she was since the day she arrived in Vulture City. Jackson listened. His face went blank in a way that Rebecca recognized because she had seen that same blankness on the faces of men who were about to deliver a verdict. The jury face, the judge face, the face of someone deciding what the truth means. What he said next was not what she expected. He did not say anything about the $200. He did not express shock about Aldrich or sympathy about her circumstances. What he said was worse. "You lied to me." His voice was quiet. That was the terrible part. Not anger, something beyond anger. "I asked if you were all right. You said fine. I asked what you were afraid of. You said nothing. I told you the worst thing I have ever done. The boy, the gun, the face I cannot stop seeing. I stood in front of you and showed you the ugliest part of myself, and you sat there silent, keeping your secret, letting me be the only one standing naked." "Jackson," she started, "I do not care about $200, Rebecca. I care that you looked me in the eye and lied." He stood. He walked to the door of the church steps where they had been sitting. He opened it. He walked through it and closed it behind him. Not a slam, a quiet, careful click, which was worse. Rebecca sat on the church steps alone and cried. Not the controlled, purposeful tears she had learned to produce on demand during years of negotiating with Aldrich. Real tears. The kind that come from a place so deep that the body shakes with them. For the first time since her mother died, Rebecca wept because she was genuinely heartbroken. She had lost him. The only person who had seen her clearly. The only man who had held her shaking hands and talked to frightened horses and said you should not have had to learn that. And she had lost him because she could not stop lying, even when lying was the last thing she needed to do. But Rebecca Norton was not a woman who sat in grief for very long. She had survived her father's death and her mother's death and years under Aldrich's roof and a runaway stagecoach over a canyon cliff. She had survived all of those things because she moved forward, always forward, even when forward meant walking into something worse than what she was leaving behind. She wiped her eyes, straightened her spine, and she made a decision, not a safe one, not a smart one, a brave one, the same kind of reckless, stubborn courage that had made her grab for the reins on a runaway stagecoach. She would confront Preston herself. Not hide, not wait for the marshal, not sit in her room hoping Jackson would forgive her. She would go to Preston with the evidence she had documented and give him a choice. Sign a paper releasing her from the engagement and leave Vulture City before the marshal arrived, or she would go public with everything she knew and they would both burn. She was done being the person things happened to. She wanted to be the person who decided. That night, Rebecca sat at the desk in her room at Hattie's boarding house and wrote a letter. She addressed it not to Jackson, but to Hattie. Inside, she placed her complete documentation of Preston's crimes, along with her own history, the truth about Aldrich and the stolen money, and the reason she had come west. Instructions were clear. If Rebecca did not return to the boarding house by morning, Hattie was to send everything to the U.S. Marshal in Prescott by the fastest means available. She buttoned her coat, checked the inside pocket where her father's scalpel lay. The small surgical blade that was the only possession from her old life that had survived every loss. It was not a weapon, not really. But it was her father's, and it meant she was not entirely alone. She walked out into the night, toward Preston Mercantile, alone. From the upstairs window, Hattie Harmon watched her go. The older woman pressed her hand flat against the glass, the same gesture Rebecca had made to Jackson from this same window days before, and whispered to the darkness, "Oh, child, what are you doing?" The dust storm hit Vulture City at 4 in the afternoon, turning the sky the color of a bruise. By the time Jackson Miller realized Rebecca was gone, he could not see 10 feet in front of his face, and the only thing guiding him through the howling dark was a wild horse who had never once in her life done what she was told. It had started as a haze on the western horizon, a brown smudge that could have been cloud or smoke or nothing. Within an hour, it was a wall. Within 2 hours, it was everything. The wind came first, hard enough to rip shingles from roofs and send tumbleweeds cartwheeling down the main street like they were trying to escape. Then the dust, fine as flour, thick as fog, turning the air into something that was neither entirely solid nor entirely breathable. Jackson had spent the night at his ranch staring at the ceiling and arguing with himself. The argument went in circles the way arguments with yourself tend to do when you are wrong and know it. He was angry at Rebecca for lying. That was real and that was legitimate. But underneath the anger was the memory of Hattie Harmon's voice. The older woman had brought him soup the previous evening, uninvited, and had stood in his doorway with her arms crossed and delivered a speech that was less a speech and more a surgical strike. "That girl dug through mine rubble to help a stranger," Hattie had said. "She set a broken bone in a mine shaft with nothing but a splint and steady hands. She saved your sorry hide on that stagecoach by keeping calm when most people would have been screaming. And you are angry because she did not tell you about $200 she took from the uncle who tried to sell her to an old man. Is that the hill you want to die on, Jackson Miller?" He had not answered because there was no good answer. By morning he knew what he needed to do. He saddled Ranger and rode for town. He was going to find Rebecca and apologize. He was going to tell her that he had been wrong, that he had reacted out of his own pain rather than her reality, that he understood lying to survive because he had been doing exactly the same thing for 13 years. He reached the boarding house as the leading edge of the storm turned the sky yellow. Hattie was on the front porch, pacing, her face drawn tight with worry. "Where is she?" Jackson asked. Hattie handed him the letter. Jackson read it standing in the rising wind with dust beginning to sting his face. He read about Preston's crimes and Rebecca's evidence, and the instructions to send everything to the marshal. He read the part about Aldrich and the money and the reason she had come to Arizona. He read the whole thing, and when he was finished, the blood had left his face entirely. "She went to confront Preston," Hattie said. "Last night. She has not come back." Jackson was running before Hattie finished the sentence. He hit the street and the storm hit him at the same time. Visibility was down to nothing. The mercantile was 300 yards away, and he could not see it. But Hellfire was at the hitching post. The wild mare had followed him to town. She did this sometimes, breaking out of the corral and trailing Ranger at a distance. And Jackson had given up trying to stop her. She was standing in the storm with her ears pinned flat and her mane whipping in the wind. And when Jackson stumbled toward her, she did something she had never done before. She turned her head toward the mercantile and walked into the storm without being led. Jackson followed the horse, because he had no other guide. Because sometimes you put your trust in the thing that bites you. Because Hellfire could see in the dust, or smell through it, or navigate by some instinct that humans had traded away for the ability to doubt themselves. They reached the mercantile. Jackson could feel the building before he could see it, the wall appearing out of the brown darkness like a cliff face. He found the back door. It was unlocked. He went inside. The store was dark. The storm had blotted out the windows, turning them into brown rectangles that admitted almost no light. The air inside was thick with dust that had forced its way through every crack and seam. Jackson could hear voices. Preston's, low and measured. Another man's, clipped and professional. Drake. And then he heard something else. A scrape of movement. Rebecca, somewhere in the room, shifting position. She was alive. The relief that hit him was so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. What Jackson did not know, what he would piece together later, was what had happened before he arrived. Rebecca had come to the mercantile the previous night. Preston was alone, sitting at his desk in the back, reviewing papers by lamplight. She had entered through the back door and placed her terms on his desk with the steady hands of a woman who had decided to stop running. She had documentation of everything. A copy was with someone she trusted. If she did not return safely, it would go to the U.S. Marshal. She placed a single sheet of paper on the desk, a statement releasing her from the engagement already drafted in her careful hand. "Sign this," she said. "Leave Vulture City before the Marshal arrives. You will have a head start. That is more than you deserve, but I am offering it anyway." Preston read the paper, looked up at her. For a moment, something almost like respect crossed his face. The respect of one calculating mind, recognizing another. "You are smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. He signed. Rebecca reached for the paper. Preston's hand came down on hers. His fingers closed around her wrist. It was the first time he had touched her since she arrived in Vulture City, and the contact sent ice through her veins. "You should have left when I offered you the chance," he said. Behind her, the back door opened. Drake stepped in, tall, scarred, a pistol on his hip, and the flat expression of a man for whom violence was a job skill rather than an emotional event. Rebecca understood immediately. She had prepared for a confrontation with Preston alone. She had not accounted for Drake. Her courage was real. Her plan was sound. But she had underestimated the depth of Preston's paranoia. He had signed the paper because he had already sent for his enforcer. The paper meant nothing to a man who intended to disappear. He just needed to make sure there were no witnesses left to tell the story. Preston had kept her there through the night and into the day, waiting for the storm to provide cover. Nobody would hear gunshots in a dust storm. Nobody would come looking until it was too late. Jackson did not know any of this yet. He only knew that Rebecca was inside, and so was Drake, and so was Preston, and the storm outside had sealed them all in together. He moved through the back storeroom. A floorboard creaked under his boot. Drake fired. The bullet punched through the wall a foot from Jackson's head, spraying splinters. Jackson dropped behind a barrel, and the world narrowed to a dark room full of dust and gunfire, and the sound of his own heartbeat roaring in his ears. He fired back. Once. Twice. Controlled. Aimed at the muzzle flash because there was nothing else to aim at. But he could not shoot freely. Rebecca was somewhere in that room, and he did not know where. And the risk of hitting her was more terrifying than anything Drake could do to him. This was when it happened. The dark room, the gunfire, the enclosed space, the smell of powder smoke. Jackson's mind cracked open like a fault line in stone, and suddenly he was not in Vulture City anymore. He was in a forest in Georgia. It was September of 1863, and he was 15 years old, and there was a boy in blue 10 feet away raising a rifle, and Jackson was raising his, and they were the same age, the same height, the same scared children playing at a war that would kill them both one way or another. The flashback swallowed him whole. For 3 seconds that lasted a lifetime, Jackson Miller was not a man in a general store. He was a boy in a war, and the gun in his hand was pointing at a face he could not stop seeing. Then a voice cut through. Jackson. Not the Union boy, not Georgia. Rebecca's voice. "Here. Now. Jackson, I am on the floor. Left side, behind the counter." He grabbed her voice the way a drowning man grabs a rope. He held on to the sound of it and hauled himself back to the present. 1878. Arizona. Dust storm. The woman he loved was behind the counter, and she needed him to be here now, not 13 years gone in a forest full of ghosts. He moved. Drake fired again, the bullet gouging the floor where Jackson had been a half-second before. Jackson fired back, aiming at the flash, and heard the solid thud of a bullet hitting flesh. Drake cursed, a short, sharp sound of pain, but he was not down. Preston tried to run for the front door. Jackson came out from behind the barrel and intercepted him. Not with a gun, with his body. He tackled Preston around the waist, and they crashed together into a shelf of goods. Cans of peaches and bottles of lantern oil hit the floor. Glass shattered. The oil spread across the planks, sharp and pungent. Preston was not a fighter. He was a schemer, a ledger man, a man who paid other men for violence. But desperation has its own kind of strength, and he clawed at Jackson's face, going for his eyes, snarling with the cornered animal fury of a man watching his empire collapse. Then Rebecca was there. She had Drake's pistol. The hired gun was on the floor clutching his shoulder where Jackson's bullet had torn through muscle and tendon. While Jackson and Preston had been fighting, Rebecca had crawled to where Drake had fallen and taken his weapon. She had not hesitated. She had not frozen. She pointed the gun at Preston and said one word. "Stop." Preston stopped. Not because of the gun, because of her face. There was no fear in it, no uncertainty, no trembling, only the absolute calm of a woman who had decided finally and completely that she was done running, done hiding, done being the person other people used and discarded and controlled. She was her father's daughter in that moment. Steady hands, clear eyes, a diagnosis delivered without flinching. Sheriff Baker arrived then, drawn by the gunfire. Even a compromised man responds to shots fired on his main street. He came through the front door with his own gun drawn and his face white with the terror of a man who knows he has waited too long to do the right thing and is about to be confronted with the cost. He took in the scene. Preston on the floor, Drake bleeding, Jackson against the shelf, pressing a hand to his shoulder where a bullet graze had opened a bloody line. Rebecca standing over all of them with a steady gun and steadier eyes. Baker took Preston and Drake into custody. He did it by the book, professional and thorough, as though doing this properly now could make up for the years he had looked the other way. It could not, but he did it anyway. Rebecca knelt beside Drake and applied pressure to his shoulder wound with the same professional detachment she would show any patient. She did not enjoy his pain. She did not refuse to help. She was a healer. That was what her father had made her, and she would not abandon it for the satisfaction of letting a man bleed who had been prepared to kill her. The storm began to break. The dust thinned. Through the shattered front window of the Mercantile, the first clear light cut through the brown air with that particular crystalline quality that only exists after a storm, when the sky has been scoured clean and the world looks new. Jackson was on the floor, his back against the counter, his shoulder bleeding, his ribs on fire, every injury he had been accumulating since the stagecoach making itself known at once. Rebecca came to him, knelt beside him, tore his shirt to examine the wound. He looked at her hands, bloody again, scraped raw from the floor, but steady, always steady when it mattered. "You came back," he said. "I never left," she said. "You did." The words hit him like the truth always hits, harder than any fist. She was right. She had been here the whole time. She had confronted Preston alone because Jackson had walked away. She had faced Drake and a dust storm and the possibility of her own death because the man who was supposed to stand beside her had chosen his anger over her need. "I am sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "Hold still. This is going to sting." The U.S. Marshal arrived in Vulture City on a Tuesday carrying a warrant for Robert Preston and a professional skepticism that lasted exactly as long as it took him to read Rebecca's documentation, examine the recovered evidence, and interview a blacksmith with a broken nose who described the entire case with the dry precision of a man who had been waiting to testify since before he was born. Marshal Sam Aldridge was from Prescott. Efficient, no nonsense, the kind of lawman who wore the badge like it meant something because to him it did. He reviewed the evidence over 2 days. Rebecca's written documentation, meticulous and clinical. The mailed copies Eli had sent from the way station. The stolen goods still cached at Drake's abandoned mine camp. Witness testimony from Tomas and Diego and other miners who had seen Drake operating near the stage road. Preston was formally arrested. Conspiracy to commit robbery, accessory to assault, fraud. He would be transported to the territorial prison at Yuma for trial. The robberies had occurred on territorial roads, which placed them under territorial court jurisdiction. His assets were seized pending adjudication. The Mercantile was shuttered, its doors locked, its freshly painted facade already collecting dust. Preston said one thing as they loaded him into the back of the marshal's wagon. He looked at Rebecca standing on the boardwalk with her arms crossed and said, "You will regret this. Without me, this town has no supply line, no credit. You will all starve by winter." Rebecca did not answer. She was done engaging with men who believed they were the only option. Drake and his 2 associates were arrested separately. Drake, his shoulder wound treated by Rebecca and Doc Henderson with equal professionalism, said nothing during processing. He was charged with armed robbery and assault, and would stand trial at the territorial courthouse in Prescott. Sheriff Baker submitted his resignation the same day. He did not make a speech. He pinned his badge on his desk, walked to his house, and began packing. Nobody tried to stop him. Some failures did not have a redemption arc. Some men just left. The days after the arrests were quiet in a way Vulture City had not been quiet in a long time, the silence of a town taking a breath after holding it too long. Rebecca sat on the porch of Hattie's boarding house with coffee and watched the town learn to function without Preston's stranglehold. It would not be easy. He had been right about the supply line and the credit. But already word had reached Phoenix about the mercantile's closure, and two competing merchants were planning to open operations in Vulture City. Competition, fair pricing, the town would survive. Towns always did. Hattie sat beside her. They were comfortable together in a way that did not require conversation. After a while, Hattie asked the question, "What are you going to do now?" Rebecca considered. She had no money, no family, no fiancé, no luggage. She owned one dress that Hattie had given her, one coat from Virginia, one scalpel that had been her father's, and one written account of a criminal conspiracy that had brought down the most powerful man in town. "I do not know," she said. And for the first time, the uncertainty did not terrify her. She could sit with it. She could let it breathe. Across town in Doc Henderson's clinic, Jackson was lying in bed with his shoulder bandaged and his ribs wrapped, and his ego in worse shape than either. Eli was in the corner chair, reading a week-old copy of the Prescott Courier with performative disinterest. His face was still bruised, his nose crooked in a way it had not been before. But he was upright and functioning, and apparently willing to sit in the same room as Jackson without throwing anything, which Jackson took as a sign that their friendship would survive. Hellfire was outside. She had broken free from the hitching post and trotted 2 miles from the ranch to the clinic for the second time. When Doc Henderson had tried to shoo her away from the front steps, the mare bit him. Doc Henderson, who had practiced medicine in the Arizona Territory for 30 years and survived 2 Apache raids and a cholera outbreak, stood on his own front porch holding his bitten hand with a look of absolute outrage. Eli did not look up from his newspaper. "Now we are all equal," he said. Jackson laughed, then regretted it immediately because laughing with cracked ribs was a particularly vicious form of suffering. Rebecca came in to change his bandages. She was professional and efficient. She did not touch him more than medical necessity required. The distance between them was precise, deliberate, measured. She was giving him space because he had been the one to walk away, and she would not bridge the gap uninvited. Jackson watched her work and understood what the distance meant. The next move was his. On the 3rd day, he was able to sit up. Rebecca came in for the morning wound check. Doc Henderson left the room with elaborate casualness, announcing that he needed to check on a patient across town who did not exist. They were alone. The clinic was quiet. Through the window, Jackson could see Hellfire standing in the street like a sentinel. "I am sorry," he said. Rebecca paused with the bandage half unwound. "For what?" "For reacting the way I did. You kept your secret because you were scared, and instead of understanding that, I punished you for it. That was not fair. You had a right to be angry. I lied. You lied to survive. I understand that better than anyone." He looked at his own scarred hands. "I lied about my age to join a war when I was 15. I have lied to every person I have met for 13 years about being fine. I have lied to myself every single day about not needing anyone. I do not get to judge you for doing the same thing I do." Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands rested on the blanket. The scars from digging through rubble to help Diego at the mine were still visible. Jackson placed his hand over hers. "I do not need you to be perfect, Rebecca. I need you to be real. And if real means you stole $200 from the man who tried to sell you and ran across the country and lied to stay alive, then I want that person." "Even knowing I might lie again," Rebecca said, "I cannot promise I will never. Then we will deal with it when it happens. Not by me walking away." The silence that followed was the best silence Jackson had ever known. The silence of two people who had said the hard things and come out the other side, still sitting next to each other. He told her the truth. Rough, unvarnished, the way he told everything. I have a small ranch. The roof leaks when it rains hard. I have a horse that bites everyone she meets. And I have bad nights, nightmares, whiskey, stretches where I will not want to talk. You deserve better than all of that. But it is everything I have. If you want it, it is yours. Rebecca looked at their hands, his over hers, the motif completing its turn. I have a history of theft, she said, a habit of lying when I'm scared, and nothing to my name except a borrowed dress and a scalpel. If you still want that, I will stay. I want it. Then I will stay. She held his hand tighter. Not a kiss, not yet, but enough. That afternoon, Jackson watched through the clinic window as Rebecca walked across the street to talk to Doc Henderson about working as his regular medical assistant. She walked the way she always walked, purposeful, chin up, moving toward something rather than away. Eli folded his newspaper, said without looking at Jackson, "Your horse is still outside." "She can find her own way home," Jackson said. "I was not talking about the horse. They got married on a Thursday. Not because Thursday held any particular significance, but because it was the first day Doc Henderson had no patience, and Eli's face had finally healed enough to fit into a borrowed vest without wincing. Jackson woke at the ranch that morning and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet. The nightmare had come last night, but it was different. He had seen the Union boy, as always, the forest, the rifle, the face. But in the dream, the boy had looked at him and nodded. Just a small nod, the kind you give someone across a room when you are acknowledging something that does not need words. Then the boy had turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees until there was nothing left but green light and silence. It was not forgiveness. Jackson knew he would carry the weight of Chickamauga for the rest of his life. But it was acceptance. Permission, maybe, from whatever part of his own mind the boy represented, to stop using guilt as a reason not to live. He got up, fed the horses. Hellfire, or Hope, as Rebecca had already started calling her over Jackson's strenuous objections, pushed her nose into his shirt pocket looking for sugar. She had been doing this more and more lately, and Jackson had started keeping sugar cubes in that pocket specifically for her, though he would deny it under oath. "I am getting married today," he told the horse. "Try to behave." The mare flicked her tail and showed her teeth. Jackson chose to interpret this as congratulations. He put on his good shirt, the one without patches, and the vest his mother had given him before she died. It was the only thing he had kept from Texas. Dark wool, hand-stitched, worn at the edges but still holding together. His hands shook slightly while he buttoned it. Not whiskey. He had not had whiskey in 3 days. This was the sober, clear-eyed trembling of a man who had spent 13 years running from everything and was about to stand still. At Hattie's boarding house, Rebecca stood in front of the mirror in a green dress that Hattie had sewn for her from fabric salvaged from the shuttered mercantile. There was a quiet justice in that, wearing something beautiful made from the ruins of the man who had tried to own her, though neither woman commented on it. Hattie pinned wildflowers into Rebecca's auburn hair. Desert marigold and brittle bush, yellow and gold against the dark red of her hair. "Scared?" Hattie asked. "Yes, good. Means you are taking it seriously." Rebecca looked at her reflection. For the first time since leaving Virginia, she recognized herself. Not the frightened girl climbing out Aldrich's window with stolen money in her pocket. Not the mail-order bride performing obedience for a man who saw her as inventory. Just Rebecca. Scarred and dishonest sometimes, and brave sometimes, and capable of terrible decisions and good ones, and currently about to marry a man who bit when he was scared, just like his horse. She touched the inside pocket of her coat, hanging on the back of the chair. Her father's scalpel was there. The only object that had survived every loss, every mile, every fire she had walked through. She left it in the pocket. She did not need to hold it today. But knowing it was there was enough. Hattie hugged her, said nothing more. Some things were better left to silence. The church was small and smelled like dust and old wood and the wildflowers Rebecca was carrying. The guests fit easily in the first 3 pews. Eli stood at the front as best man, his face still carrying the faded yellow of old bruises, wearing a vest that obviously belonged to someone considerably larger. He looked uncomfortable and proud and deeply irritated by both feelings. Doc Henderson sat in the front row with his medical bag at his feet, because Doc Henderson went nowhere without his medical bag. Hattie sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she had ironed specifically for the occasion. Tomas was there, and his brother Diego, who had come on a cane because the leg Rebecca had set in the mine was healing well, but not yet strong enough to bear full weight. Mrs. Gutierrez from the Mexican settlement had come with tamales wrapped in cloth. 2 ranch wives from the outlying homesteads sat together, women who had welcomed Rebecca with the practical warmth of people who understood that survival in the territory required neighbors who would show up. Not many people, not grand, not the kind of wedding that got written about in territorial newspapers, but it was real. And the people who were there because they wanted to be, which was more than could be said for most gatherings. The minister spoke the words. Jackson and Rebecca faced each other. His hands were shaking. Hers were still. She took his hands in hers, held them the way he had held hers outside the mine that day, steady and firm and without speaking. The shaking stopped. When the minister asked, "Do you take this woman?" Jackson said, "I do," before the sentence was finished. Rebecca laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and surprised. And the sound of it filled the small church the way light fills a room when you open the shutters. It was the most beautiful sound Jackson had ever heard, and he planned to spend the rest of his life figuring out how to make it happen again. Rings. Eli had forged them at his shop. Iron, not gold, dark and rough and unpolished. Not beautiful in any way that a jeweler would recognize, but strong. The kind of thing that lasted. Eli placed them in Jackson's palm. Their eyes met. 13 years of friendship, of silence and coffee and truths, told in the dark of a forge, passed between them in a look. "Do not lose these," Eli said. "I am not making more." The reception was on Hattie's porch. Food brought by neighbors. A bottle of good whiskey from Doc Henderson, who made Jackson promise to drink it slowly and in company, rather than fast and alone. It was a promise Jackson intended to keep. Doc Henderson found Jackson during the celebration and pulled him aside with the directness of a man who had been practicing medicine long enough to have no patience for small talk. "Your wife has better medical instincts than half the trained physicians I have worked with. Send her to me 3 days a week. I will pay her a proper wage." Jackson felt something warm spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. Rebecca's future. Not as a wife who stayed home and waited. As a healer. The thing her father had made her. The thing she was meant to be. Hattie announced she was repainting the boarding house sign. New name, Harmon House. All welcome. She said this while looking directly at Mrs. Gutierrez, who smiled and nodded. 2 words, all welcome. In a town that had spent years drawing invisible lines between who belonged and who did not, those 2 words were a revolution. Eli was offered the interim deputy position by Marshal Aldridge, the first half Apache man to wear a badge in the territory. Not everyone in town was comfortable with this development. Eli was aware of the discomfort and spectacularly indifferent to it. When Jackson congratulated him, Eli shrugged. "Do not read too much into it. The pay is terrible and the office smells like baker's whiskey." There was one more thing Rebecca did before the day was over. She wrote a letter, not long, addressed to Aldrich Norton in Richmond, Virginia. Inside the envelope, she placed $200 in cash, the exact amount she had taken. Jackson had sold one of his trained horses to cover it. The letter read, "This is my father's money. Returned. We are settled. Do not contact me again. Signed, Rebecca Miller." The loop closed. The guests left as the sun went down. The sky did what the Arizona sky does at sunset. It burned gold, then copper, then deep violet, then filled with more stars than any other place on Earth can show you. It was excessive and beautiful and completely indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath it, which was somehow comforting. The desert did not care about their problems. It had been here for 1,000 years, and would be here for 1,000 more, and its beauty was not contingent on anything they did or did not do. Jackson and Rebecca sat on the porch of the ranch. Their porch now, their home. His arm was around her shoulders and her head rested against his chest, over the place where his ribs had broken the day they met and had since healed. They did not speak for a while. They had discovered something about each other over the past weeks, a discovery more valuable than any words. Silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of two people who had said the hard things and did not need to fill every gap with noise. From the barn, Hope whinnied, and a higher, smaller sound answered her, the foal. Hope had been pregnant when Jackson acquired her and nobody had known. She had foaled 2 weeks ago, a leggy filly with her mother's wild eyes and an immediate inclination to bite the fence posts. Rebecca had named the foal. Jackson had objected. Rebecca had overruled him. This was, he was learning, going to be a pattern. "Do you think about that day?" Rebecca asked. "The stagecoach." "Sometimes." "What do you think about?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, searching for the honest answer, not the comfortable one. "I think about how I almost did not chase it. I was halfway through a bottle that morning. I almost just let it go." Rebecca absorbed this. "But you did not." "No." "Why?" He thought about it, really thought about it, there on the porch, with the stars coming out, and the woman he loved leaning against him, and the sound of horses breathing in the barn. "I do not know," he said. "I think maybe some part of me wanted a reason to stop not caring whether I lived or died. And then there you were." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I was running. The whole time. From Aldrich, from Virginia, from everything. I thought I was running away. Were you?" "I was. But I was also running toward something. I just did not know what it was until I got here." 6 months later. Morning. Jackson woke from a nightmare, but it was different now. The dream was the stagecoach again, falling into the canyon, the sound of wood and iron, the 200-foot drop. But in the dream, the coach was empty, nobody inside. He reached for it anyway, instinct and memory, and the dream dissolved into morning light. He woke. Rebecca was beside him, asleep, breathing in the slow rhythm of deep rest. He listened to her breathe for a while. The sound of it was the most ordinary thing in the world and the most precious. The sound of someone who had chosen to be here, who kept choosing every morning. He got up, pulled on his boots, went to the porch. Dawn over the desert. The light came up in layers. Gray, then blue, then gold. The air was cool and smelled of sage and dust and the particular sweetness of a morning that has not yet been ruined by the heat. From the corral, Hope nickered. The foal, Lucky, Rebecca's terrible name for a horse that Jackson had stopped arguing about 3 months ago, ran in wobbly circles across the yard. She was gangly and graceless and completely fearless, running without any particular direction but with absolute commitment, the way young things always did. Footsteps behind him. Rebecca came out wrapped in a blanket, hair loose, eyes half closed with sleep. She did not speak. She stood beside him and looked at the sunrise. The foal ran past them, all legs and energy, and the uncomplicated joy of being alive on a morning that was brand new. "She runs just like her mother," Rebecca said, voice still thick with sleep. "Does not know where she is going, does not care." Jackson watched the foal, watched the sun, watched the woman standing next to him in a borrowed blanket in the cold morning light, with gold flecks catching in her green eyes. The same flecks he had seen for the first time in the wreckage of a stagecoach, when she had looked at him without blinking and said, "I know." "She is not lost," he said. "She is just running toward something she has not found yet." Rebecca looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light did what morning light does to two people who love each other. It made everything simple. She took his hand. He held on. The foal ran. The sun rose. The desert stretched in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful, the way it had for longer than memory, and would continue long after every human story had been told and forgotten. Two people stood on a porch and watched the light come up. They were not perfect. They were not healed. They were scarred and stubborn and prone to the same mistakes they had always made. She would lie when she was scared. He would retreat when he was hurt. They would fight about the horse's name and the leaking roof and whether whiskey before noon counted as a problem. They would fail each other in small ways and find each other again, because that was what the commitment meant. Not perfection, persistence. But they were here, together, choosing this, choosing each other, every morning, despite everything they knew about themselves and each other and the world. That was not a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, the person you saved turned out to be the one who was running toward you all along. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.